Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters Podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Hey guys, Liz Lang here with Dr. Mark Burton, and this week we're going to continue talking about John Gottman's book, The 7 Principles for Making Marriage Work, and the subtitle to that is A Practical Guide from the Country's Foremost Relationship Expert. And I would almost make the argument and say he might even be the world's foremost expert.
I'd agree with that. I think you're probably right because, he goes all over the world talking about this and people come from all over the world to hear him. I don't know of any other person. I kind of keep up on that, who's doing the work in marriage. And I haven't run into anyone who's like.
I mean, anyone who is in the world of therapy knows who John Gottman is.
Right. I mean, as I said last week, he's a good marketer, but he also has really good research. And so I said that he's not that great of a therapist, but his research is really first class, really. And he has that kind of mind, as far as setting up what the study has been. So, yeah, I agree with you. He's probably one of the world's experts on relationships and marriage.
Yeah.
And I think I mentioned this, one of the first things he does, one of the first things I do with couples in that first session is you ask, how did you meet? And what you do is you pay attention to the story, but that's not really what you're paying attention to. Mostly you're paying attention to how they are when they are retelling the story. So I had a new couple, I think it was yesterday, and it's pretty gratifying. And when you say, okay, tell me how you met, and they really brighten when they tell their meeting story. And then okay, there's a lot of hope here because they fondly remember, they easily remember the good things about each other, before things got tough. So.
Yeah, which, totally makes sense because, you don't just marry someone.
There's a reason we get married.
Yeah.
And sometimes we forget about it.
Yeah, well, or sometimes relationships, they lose their way a bit. And I think that's very common and very, very easy to do. And because as I was thinking about doing some of these exercises with Curtis, because we're always looking for new and different in-home date ideas because we've got 3 kids and it's hard to find a sitter and then, school and for the kids and everything. And so I told Curtis, we're going to do this. This is going to be date nights. We're going to start going through some of these questionnaires. And part of it is we really like just good dialogue, me in particular, and he enjoys it too, but I really get a sense of emotional and intellectual satisfaction from having good dialogue with people. That's a very important mental health need for me. And so
it's a connecting exercise. You connect with people.
Yeah. So
while we're talking about this, I'll just mention Gottman has on my app, it's just called Gottman Card Decks, and it's free to download. At least it was when I downloaded it. And so it's one of those things, like I'm looking at the app right now. It has a section on love maps. And so if you click on love maps, then it just gives you some teaching. But mostly I use it or suggest it. There's one called open-ended question. And so, if you want to spend some time together on a date night and you're looking for some questions, here's the first one that pops up. Have your goals in life changed recently? And so, you can talk about that. There are date questions. There are sex questions. And they even have, he calls it salsa, mild, medium, and hot, which I think, and I think it has to do with sexuality in couples. So, if couples, need some ideas, I think his Gottman card decks are pretty helpful.
Yeah, I agree. We've only been married for 10 years, but I would start to get that feeling like, man, I want to connect with him more, but it can be hard to find ways to do that because especially given that for the last almost 4 years now, he's worked from home and we're together all the time. And so we know so much about each other's world. And I remember when he first started working from home, I was worried that we would kind of get sick of it and we would both want him to go back to the office. It hasn't happened for either of us. We both love it. We both love being able to spend time with each other throughout the day and being there for each other. And it's been great. But, on that flip side, we've had to find innovative ways to reconnect because we know everything about each other's worlds.
Right.
So.
Tomorrow's my anniversary, 45 years.
Well, congratulations.
And Lindy and I have been working together
Uh-huh.
for at least 20 years in
Yeah.
the same building. And so, that's worked for us. And so you're right. You have to continually figure out new ways to connect, new things to do.
Yeah. Well, a very happy anniversary to
Thank you.
you and Lindy.
Thank you.
45 years. That's a milestone. I
It
mean,
was.
especially in today's world with divorce rates being so high, 45 years, that's an achievement. Okay, so let's go ahead and dive into principle 3, which is turning toward each other instead of away. And he gives this brief example in the beginning of the chapter about a couple who are having this small engagement. And so the husband looks out a window and says, "Look at that boat." The wife peers over her magazine and says, "Yeah, it looks like that big schooner we saw last summer, remember?" And the husband grunts. And John Gottman goes on to say how entertaining he finds little moments like that. It's so mundane, but he finds that fascinating because what's happening is these brief exchanges, they're connecting. And those are really important for a healthy marriage.
Right. He calls them bids for connection. Mm-hmm. And this took place in his lab on Lake Washington, which I think I described last week. And so they're actually looking out over Lake Washington where they do have those sailboats. So this is one of my only sports analogies I think that I ever use.
Okay.
And this may have come from him as far as I know. But it's almost like you've got the ball. And so I'm going to play ball with you and I'm going to throw the ball over to you. Now you have choices at that point. You can catch the ball and throw it back. You could catch the ball and just hold on to it and not do anything. Or you can just let it go by like I didn't even see that ball coming towards me. And so it's the same with those bids for connection. You can have a positive response.
Yeah. You
can have a neutral response, or you can have a negative response. And so there are many of these opportunities when we're together, as a couple, there are many of these opportunities. And I think there's a lot that goes into it. And he would say that this is really an important factor in a healthy marriage. And I think what's happening is it's like you're seeing the other person. So if we go to this example, hey, isn't that a beautiful boat or whatever it is? And if the husband's just looking at his newspaper and doesn't say anything, he may even take the newspaper down and look, but then not say anything.
Yep.
That's a fairly negative, that's probably a neutral response more than a negative one. But it's like, I'm not interested in you and I don't really care what you think about the boat. And yes, it might be like the schooner we saw a year ago. And so it's saying, really don't care about you and I'm not interested. If there's a negative response. And so the negative response would be, what do you mean that boat? That is the ugliest boat I've ever seen. I don't know why you'd be interested in that. So that's more of a negative response.
Yeah.
And it's not validating at all. It's not validating at all to something that is really, in some ways benign, because you're just mentioning the boat. But, think of how many times this might happen with Curtis in your life. You just come in, you're connecting after a day, or you might be looking outside and saying something. The way we respond is really important in the relationship.
And I think it's being aware of what's going on.
Yes.
Because it's so easy to be distracted. In fact, that's the next part that he gets into is 2 obstacles to turning toward each other. So things that could prevent it. And one is missing a bid because it's wrapped in anger or other negative emotions. And this one I thought was kind of interesting because, I would almost say that's more of a conflict that's happening, at least from my perspective. When I first read that, I was like, I guess there is a bid for affection going on, but that feels more like a conflict that's happening because there's a reason why this person is angry at you.
Well, it could be, I don't know that I'd call it a bid for affection. I think it's a bid for connection,
Okay.
possibly. And, depending on the couple, sometimes we make what might be considered a negative bid because connection, whether it's negative or positive, is better than no connection at all. And so I think it's just wanting to connect. But you said something just a second ago that I think is important. And sometimes we miss bids for connection. And you'll know the answer to this. What's the biggest distractor for bids of connection in our world?
Oh, yeah. Mark's holding up his cell phone
I'm
right
turning on
now.
my phone. You
Oh,
can't
yeah.
see it, but there it is. And so, it's not going to be surprising to you or the listeners how many times in my office someone says, well, he's always on his phone. Well, in fact, the couple that I was talking about, I asked them also, tell me about what your day looks like. Tell me about what a typical evening is. And it is so often that, yes, the kids are in bed and we're together. And yeah, he's on his phone or his pad, or she's on the phone or the pad, or they're looking at Facebook or Instagram or whatever it is. And so you have to be really careful. You have to pay attention.
Yeah.
You have to be present. And I think that if you are not present, if you're distracted by electronics, you are going to miss those bids for connection.
Yeah. And I would say that can go both ways. I think sometimes you need to be obvious in your bids for affection. So mine and Curtis's first few months of marriage, I used to get so mad at him because he would play video games. And it's like when he was done with his day or done with whatever, he would want to go play video games. And I'm like, I wanted him to want to spend time with me, but I didn't say that. And so I would just get mad at him because he was doing something. And so, eventually we came to this, I guess, accommodation of I just tell him, I say, hey, I want to do something with you. And he'll say, yeah, sure. Let me wrap up what I'm doing and we'll go do something. I think you're right that we need to not just constantly be on our phone. Right? We shouldn't constantly be distracted by technology. But the flip side of that is you need to tell your partner, you need to tell your spouse, hey, I want to spend time with you. I want to disconnect. And I think it's also very important to set time aside very regularly where we say no cell phones, no technology, no distractions. This is time for just us.
Yes. A common problem in relationships is what I call unfulfilled expectations. And so if you assume that your partner knows what your expectation is, but you haven't voiced it, you're probably going to be disappointed. And so you're exactly right. You voice the expectation. And then hopefully the expectation is fulfilled. If it's not, then that's kind of a separate problem. But if your partner has no idea what your expectation is, that's kind of on you, to be able to say this is what's going on. But I agree again with you as far as the electronics free zone. I mean, it's surprising to me how often I need to say to couples, you need to take this time and stick your phones in a drawer or your tablets in a drawer, because even if you turn them to silent, you're still going to hear them, see them vibrate or do something, and you will automatically look towards it. If it's sitting there, you look towards it and it pulls your attention away even momentarily. But it also gives this very subtle message that phone is more important than you in the moment. So I think the way around it is just stick them in a drawer or put them in another room. I think it's really important for everyone to have electronic free zone. But by the way, this is a bit of an aside, but even many people who are advocating, even if you're single and not in a relationship, you've got to get rid of the electronics for a time.
Yeah.
We are too hooked into that.
I completely agree. Do anything that's not technology. Leave your cell phone at home and go for a walk. Get outside, go do something, no matter what your circumstances are. The very least you can do that. Just take time to unplug.
Yeah, we need to unplug.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think the bids for I call it bids for connection. Does he call it bids for affection?
I think he does call it bids for connection. But I mean, a bid for connection, it's probably the same thing. Or maybe I'm just equating them because for me, a bid for connection is a bid for affection. Because connecting on emotional and an intellectual level, that's very important to me. And so maybe I'm just equating the two as being one and the same, because I guess to me they kind of are.
Well, see, the way I look at it, it's sometimes about hey, look at me, notice me, I'm here.
Yeah.
You might be reading your paper, but hey, look at that boat. And I'm interested in that car or whatever it is. And the connection or the response doesn't have to be a lot.
Yeah.
It does need to be positive, though.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then it's just you have this brief connection. And so what Gottman found is in couples who are successful, there are quite a few of those brief connections throughout the day.
And I would say this even extends to outside relationships. So as a stay-at-home mom, I'm constantly doing a lot of, like dishes, cleaning. And if I'm doing a chore or something monotonous that I don't necessarily enjoy doing, I'm listening to something while I'm doing it. And it's usually like a show or politics or a podcast. It's one of the other, one of those two. And so I've just gotten into that mindset of I'm going to regularly pause. I'm going to have to pause a lot and stop what I'm doing and pay attention to whoever's trying to get my attention. And it happens several times a day, probably several times an hour. Somebody interrupts me and I have to hit pause and focus on them. And I remember this one time, my sister-in-law was there and I was doing dishes and we'd been staying together in the same house for several weeks. And she's like, man, I'm always interrupting you when you're listening to something. And I told her, I was like, yeah, but I'm always listening to something, so interrupt me. Because, it's those bids for connection and those are, they're outside of your marriage. So I think it's very important to be aware of your outside world.
Right. That's true. And so I just want to mention before we move on to the next topic that we won't go into detail about the exercises. I think they're really good. And that actually, I think all the exercises in the book are good. So I strongly suggest that couples, you consider reading it together and then certainly doing the exercises together. And the exercises, I think in most chapters, in this one as well, are extensive enough that you probably won't be able to do them all in one sitting, which is fine. So don't think, oh, we're going to sit down and do one chapter. I think you probably need to take a couple of nights, or, different times to do each chapter.
Yeah. When I told Curtis that we were going to do these exercises, he's like, there's only so much I can do. And I'm like, well, yeah, he's like, I can only do that for so long. And I'm like, yeah, that's fair. I don't expect us to get through all of them in one night.
And you bring up a really good point, though, and that's about boundaries, because I've certainly run into couples where one says, I can do it, but it goes on all night. So differences in couples, one person might think, oh, this is great to go on all night. Yep. Whereas the partner's saying, yeah, I can do an hour at the most. And so again, it's about the expectations. Yeah. Yes, I will do this with you. My expectation is we'll spend an hour tonight and then we can do it again another night. So,
yes, yeah. The important point is that you're both willing to do it together. That is what matters.
Before we leave bids for connection, pay attention to your partner. And I think when I was reviewing this chapter, one of the words that came out to me is curiosity, which I know we've mentioned that before. And I think having curiosity in your partner, what they think, what they're certainly feeling, how they experience the world is really, really important. And I think this is, to me, this bids for connection kind of goes on and connects with love maps in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I think that makes total sense. So let's go ahead and move on to principle number 4. Let your partner influence you. And for some reason, this chapter kind of rubbed me the wrong way a little bit.
Well, tell me how.
Okay, so because it kind of seemed to just be like, I guess maybe he seemed too biased against men. And maybe it was
against men?
Yes. Okay. Well, because I feel like the whole chapter, he's just talking about men. You need to be better listeners to your wives and you need to let your wives influence you. And I'm like, well, I don't know if that necessarily tracks with today's world because today women are, I don't know. And maybe it's just the time that this book was written in. But he's had how many editions and he hasn't edited this?
I like your passion about this. I think you're right. I think there could be, some timing. But let me tell you, from my experience, that he did write the book. I don't know when that first came out, 20 years ago at least. Yeah. So have things changed? I think a little bit, but not a lot. Okay. And so what I find, and you and I may get into a very long discussion on this, I think we still live in a male-dominated world.
Okay.
And things are changing, but it's still male dominated. And so I want to acknowledge, I see couples who are struggling.
Right.
So I'm not talking about all the couples that are out there, the vast majority of couples where things are working pretty well.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not unusual to have a couple come in and the male in the couple is the one who's in charge, who makes the decisions.
Mm-hmm.
And so I still think it's relevant. And it's based on his research, the outcome from his research, which is that it's more common for men not to take on the influence of their spouses. Now, in my edition, there's an example of an LDS bishop in there. Did you read
Okay.
that?
I
And I had a problem with that
okay.
because, and I'll tell you why. Here's essentially what it is. So, he points out from this LDS perspective that it has a tradition of the patriarch being the one in charge.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I think that's common for a lot of religious traditions.
Mm-hmm.
But this bishop was talking about how important it was for him to talk with this man who happened to be a bishop, and talk about, what are your ideas? What are the ideas? How are we going to decide this? But then in the end, and Gottman left this in, the male says, and then I make the decision.
Oh, yeah.
Whereas I think the appropriate response would be, and then we
Yeah.
make the decision together, because the idea is you're a team.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just you and I'm, taking into account your ideas. We're a team in this. And so I think for me, accepting influence, statistically, Gottman would say to you, it's more often the man who doesn't take the influence of his wife.
And I guess from my own perspective or from my own experience, that tracks true. Thinking back to my parents, I think my dad definitely could have done this more when I was growing up. And it was definitely a skill that Curtis had to learn. I've shared this before, but Curtis is 5 years older than me, and he has been pretty much independent and mostly self-sufficient since he was about 16.
Right.
And so he's had many, many years of independence, financial independence, and living life in whatever way pleases him. And he did a pretty good job, obviously. And so when I came along, he had to adjust because it was really easy for him to just listen to what I had to say and then do what he wanted to anyways. And he only did it a couple of times. And I said, hey, this is how I feel. And he's corrected it. And it's never been a major problem. So yeah, I guess in my own experience, that tracks true. But I guess maybe what it is I think that women can learn from their husbands too. And women need to let their husbands influence them as well. Does that make sense?
Yes, I agree. I don't think most women have difficulty with that. I think that's why we
Yeah.
didn't address it. I don't know that it's a skill they need to learn because they've had to learn that growing up in our culture. I
Yeah.
think the important thing, and I don't know if Gottman wrote this today, would he write a different chapter? He might.
Mm-hmm.
If I were writing this, I would slant it more with the idea of you are a team. When you get married, you're a team. You're a team in everything. You're a team in parenting. You're a team in finances. I think when we've talked about sexuality, I said you're a sexual team. And
Yeah.
so you've got to talk about it. And each of your opinions is as valid as the other.
Yeah, I agree.
Marriage is all about accommodation and compromise.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I think, if you go into the relationship knowing, okay, this is about compromise, and you can't really compromise well until you listen well to each other. And so it's, at some point, like if you have a decision about what you do in the garden, there might be a good compromise, but sometimes there is no compromise. Sometimes it's
Mm-hmm.
yes, we do, or no, we don't.
Yeah.
And I think the process, we've talked about communication in the past, the process of really that listening, the empathy, the validation, I've seen this, I believe it to be true, that if you do that well, then you can give up. You can say, okay, I can see this is important to you. Let's do it your way this time. You shouldn't keep track. And I don't know if you shouldn't keep a scorecard.
Yeah. Yep.
essentially. And I don't know if it's this chapter or the previous chapter where he talks about that. And he would use the term quid pro quo, which I think is the Latin term for this, for that,
Mm-hmm.
meaning I'll do this if you do that. That doesn't work either in a marriage.
Right.
But you have to somehow have it be fairly reciprocal and equal over time. So it's not, in any given moment, it may not feel equal, but over time it's got to be. So if, for instance, if it's always going one direction, either, the wife is the one who's making the choices or the husband, that's not going to feel good to the other
No,
at
it's
some
not.
point. And so I think men have a little more difficult time accepting influence, I would say, from anyone else, not just their wives. Given that we're talking in the context of a marriage, I think men have trouble accepting influence from most people. They think they know it all. A lot of men do. I'm making a general statement.
Right. And I was just gonna say, I mean, maybe a little bit, because I think what's one thing that Curtis does really well is when we have a decision to make, I feel like we do a pretty good job of making it together. And I think another good thing we're talking about is you have to understand different processes in decision making.
Oh
And
yeah.
and that's really important when it comes to compromise and accommodation, especially when you are making a really important decision. One of you might come to a conclusion or an opinion faster, and the other one might take more time. So I had a pretty good example of this recently with Curtis, where I told him, I'm like, I think maybe it might be a good time to have another baby. And it's not like I was like burning, and I'm sure this is very common with a lot of couples, and it's not like I'm like, I really, really want another baby. But I felt like, if we're going to have another one, now feels like the right time. And I brought this up with him, and he's kind of like, I don't feel like that at all. And I said, okay, well, when you come to this conclusion, let me know.
That's one of those. That is common not a common. It happens frequently. There's no compromise. You
No.
can't have half a kid.
Nope.
You either do or you don't.
Yeah.
But I just want to point out something, Liz. You and Curtis have worked at this.
Yes,
You've
we have.
so I understand your process, and it sounds like a good process. But as you pointed out a minute ago, it wasn't that way at the start of the marriage,
Mm-hmm.
and you helped him to change that.
Yeah.
And so I think that men need to be aware that, especially, you again brought up a really good point about Curtis being independent, and he's on his own for many years, and so in some ways it's like making that shift from being a single person to a married person.
Yeah.
And I often find that is difficult for some people. And again, I'll make a general statement. It's usually more difficult for men than it is for women. And I think it goes back to, we raise men to be independent. And I think the contract of marriage is necessarily you give up some of that independence.
Yep. Yeah.
It's part of the deal. And if you aren't ready to give some of that independence up, then don't get married,
Yeah.
because you cannot get married and then behave as a single person.
Some people might say, or they might find it odd that my spouse always knows where I am. And you might think, well, that sounds controlling. Why do you need to keep tabs on each other? And it's like, it's a common courtesy thing. I mean, you're married, you're a partner. I always know where Curtis is and what he's doing. And it's the same thing. I mean, and I'm not talking about like, oh, hey, I'm going to lunch with a friend. Oh, well, where are you going? It's just, I mean, I'll ask because I want to know. But in general, we always know what the other is doing.
So this ties back to love maps. And I was thinking about this tonight. I think he probably put love maps in there at the first, because in a lot of ways, some of these things tie back to that. Because I agree, knowing where your partner is, I don't see it as controlling. If Lindy sometimes works later than I do, and so I'll come home and I'll start dinner. I like to know when she leaves the office.
Mm-hmm.
And so, because then I know, when to start, putting something in the oven. And so it's just, I agree with you. It's more of a common courtesy. I don't see it as a control issue at all. Although can certainly move into that realm of control. And I think you have to be very careful about that. And so I'm going to lunch with my friends. Well, where are you going and how long are you going to be? I think the important thing is, oh, you're going to go have lunch with your friends. See, this falls into the love match thing. Who are you going, even who are you going with? Oh, I hope you have a nice time. It's not any more complicated than that. But if it gets into, you have to be back by this time, or, I don't want you to go to that restaurant, go to this restaurant. Now, I have heard that from couples, that type of control.
Yes, or I don't like that you're going with this person.
With that person, I hear that all the time. I don't like that. I don't like your friend. I don't want you to be with him or her. And so that is controlling. That's not what you and I are talking about right now.
Right. Yes.
It's just being able to, going back to the chapter, which is listen to each other with empathy and validation. And that way, when you have to make a decision, whatever it is, it's a better decision and you both feel better about it.
Yeah. So before we leave this principle, I wanted to ask what your thoughts are in this specific quote that says, despite what many therapists will tell you, you don't have to resolve your major marital conflicts for your marriage to thrive. From a counselor's perspective or from a therapist's perspective, what are your thoughts on that?
I disagree with that because I think, and maybe we're getting into semantic argument here about what is major marital issue. I don't see how you go on with major marital issues that are unresolved, because somebody's going to be either angry or resentful. And so I think that you need to resolve them. Now, when you started reading that, I thought you were going to say you don't have to resolve them right now, which I do believe is true.
Right.
You don't have to resolve everything right now or tonight. Sometimes you need more time, and sometimes you need to think about it. You mentioned processing speed or how we come to decisions. And so, you aren't going to do everything right now. But I disagree with that. I think you need to resolve major issues at some point.
All right. So next week, we are going to talk a little bit more about solving your solvable problems. And in the meantime, I hope everyone has a good week.
Have a good week, everyone.
Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.